Good evening, I'm Kathy Lewis. Welcome to What Matters. Together, they reach more than 300,000 readers Monday through Saturday, nearly twice as many on Sunday. They are the Virginian-Pilot and the Daily Press, the two daily newspapers serving Hampton Roads. But there's a weekly paper based in Norfolk that's also played a very meaningful role, not only close to home, but across the nation as well. The New Journal and Guide has played a crusading role in the lives of its readers. Tonight, an editor's roundtable, something that will be a regular feature here at What Matters. We'll meet the faces behind the editorials and get a sense of how editorial opinions are rendered. And I'll have a final thought, a plea really, about the prospective sale of the Virginian-Pilot. We're happy to have with us tonight from the Daily Press, editor Ernie Gates. Nice to have you with us tonight, Ernie. Always good to see you. Editorial page writer from the Virginian-Pilot, Don Lozado. Nice to have you, Don.
Thanks for having me. And
from the Journal and Guide, the New Journal and Guide, the publisher and editor Brenda Andrews. Nice to have you with us tonight. I'm delighted to have this conversation with all of you. We wanted to talk a little bit, first of all, to put the faces to the names, about what it is that brought each of you here. Because, Don Lozado, you're someone who we've read. We see a little picture about that big in the Pilot.
Very funny looking one.
So what is it that brought you to the Pilot?
I got back here. I'd like to say I got back here as quickly as I could. I went to school at William & Mary and then traveled around the country and the world, but was in Virginia a couple times and then came back here about 9 years ago.
And your experience at William & Mary, I remember one of the editorials that you wrote, the editorial opinions about, in the wake of the resignation of President Nickel, talking about whose college it is. I thought that was a very interesting perspective.
It's an interesting experience to live so close to your alma mater, because I go back there, I've taken my kids back there, we've walked around the campus, but you feel like a visitor. When I was there, it was my place, it was my home, but 20 years later, I guess now, it doesn't feel quite the same.
That was an interesting piece. Ernie Gates, how about you? What brought you to Hampton Roads and the Daily Press?
I've been here now 30 years just in this business. And originally, my family's from Virginia. I grew up in Baltimore and Philadelphia, but came back here to go to William & Mary. Liked it, spent a couple of years in Washington, came back to Williamsburg, and my wife and I raised our family there.
It's such a great place to
still
raise
there
a family.
today.
Yeah, no question about it. Brenda Andrews, how about you?
Well, I came here to visit my family members, and I was just getting out of the U.S. Army as a military journalist and met the, at that time, owner of the paper, who was also looking for a replacement in the editorial department, and we talked, and I said, I'll do this for a little while. That was 1982.
Yeah, famous last words. That's how we all have a story like that. Those of us who've been, I was going to stay here for a little while and then move on, and then famous last words.
Right.
Well, it's good to have you here. And the New Journal and Guide is such an interesting paper because it has a very rich history, more than 100 years old.
108. Yeah, it's really, and what's so exciting is that this year we're going to be digitized all the way back to 1925.
Wow.
So we'll be accessible on the internet across the world for museums and libraries and researchers and historians to access information that has been recorded over that time period.
And no question that the civil rights, much of the history of the civil rights movement has really been recorded by the New Journal and Guide.
I would think so, at least recorded from the African-American perspective, and that's what we do best. We record from our community's viewpoint. And until more recently, of course, it was the black press that was doing that recording.
It's been a very interesting evolution. One of the issues about which we wanted to get all of your thoughts tonight has to do with the thing about which people say we are in crisis, which has to do with transportation in this community. And so I'm wondering, as you look at this as an editorial issue, Ernie Gates, one of the interesting developments in transportation from your corner of the market has been the introduction of the possibility now, someone suggests the inevitability of improvements at the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel, in addition to that package of 6 projects we've been hearing so much about.
I think it's very clear in the political process that the 6 projects were chosen from a regional perspective, and a lot of people on the peninsula felt left out in the cold by that, and they feel left out in the cold every time they cross the bridge tunnel that was going to get no improvement whatever. Would have had some relief from the other projects, no question, but it didn't feel like there was any immediate payback, and there was a pretty immediate and high price. Now, people have to understand there's going to be a price.
Right.
There's going to be a lot of user fees. There ought to be more of a gas tax. There's a lot of ways, but you're going to get what you pay for in this. But,
and as you hear the letters, as you read the letters that you receive from folks on the peninsula about that, to what degree do those letters shape your coverage of that issue?
we pay attention to letters. We also have a feedback line that we run every day. So it's emails and letters and telephone calls, and a lot of that is feedback that's political, that's about issues, and it tells you what people are excited about. You can't treat it as a poll. It's not a survey, but it tells you that people who are really engaged and can be passionate about things take the trouble to sound off.
Right.
And you have to take into account that they're sounding off, but it means something.
One of the things that those who've been looking at this issue say is, if you were to do improvements at the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel, it may be more of an emotional victory than an actual engineering accomplishment, if that makes sense, or something that would actually have the effect of relieving transportation at the tunnel. And it really points up that intersection where you have to have the engineering, but you also have to have the politics of this thing too.
It's a really good combination, you're right. One of the things that's interesting right now is how some of the peninsula politicians in particular, who were not absent, but their voices were small in the regional conversation, now they're standing up, I think because there's been a lot of noise, and they're standing up and saying, well, what about this? What about this? How about a bridge? How about 2 lanes instead of 4? How about tolls to pay for an expansion? Ideas that are now coming up to the table that would have been good to hear more strongly, with more juice behind them 5 years ago or 3 years ago. And I think it's clearly the intersection of politics that has now made those voices loud, and they may not make engineering sense in the end, or they may not make economic sense. Tolls are only part of the problem. You might remember the company that wanted to public-private partnership on 460 assumed the tolls at a very high rate would never pay for the project unless they were subsidized by another toll on 64 between Richmond and Newport News. So a little toll on the bridge tunnel may be part of the issue, but the engineering is going to say and the economics are going to say you need more than that.
And this is a very complex subject, Don Lozado.
It is. I mean, you have to understand the transportation system, as a complicated place where if you squeeze one tube, it sends all the traffic over to another tube, because that's all we have are tubes. But Ernie's right. I think this is a political conversation now. I mean, this isn't about the engineering. It's not about how we get the traffic best around Hampton Roads. It's about how can we get a package that we'll all agree to. And perhaps the peninsula has been less vocal about some of the projects in the past. I worry, frankly, that this, if we get sidelined, if we go down this road where we're talking about the HRBT, we're going to forget about the other 6 projects which are of equal or greater importance.
Has that been a tough sell from an editorial perspective? Because
Which part?
The 6 projects, the discussion around those 6 projects. One of the observations that we've just made over time is that this, if you look at the planning on this thing, this planning's gone back 10, 15 years. I mean, it's been a long time we've been at this, but it seems that the public is only getting engaged in recent months and years, which means these projects are pretty far down the road by the time the public really gets engaged in it.
Right. I mean, I think the third crossing remains a very difficult sell. It's very expensive. It's hard to see without taking into account all the other transportation bottlenecks to see how it would best eliminate backups and how it would take some of the pressure off the HRBT and off of other crossings. I go back, I live in Suffolk, and I go back to what happened with the Kings Highway Bridge. When we tried to change it late in the process, what ended up happening was the Kings Highway Bridge was broken up and taken away, and there's no bridge there now. I think at some point we have to just make a decision that we're going to move forward on the projects that make the most sense. I agree that studying the HRBT is a terrific idea, but that shouldn't sort of stand in the way of building what we can build and what we can afford to build right now.
Yeah, it's an interesting point about this whole idea of bringing the public into the conversation, and I've really struggled with that because, Brenda Andrews, it seems to me that one of the things that is missing from this conversation is meaningful public input, which is not to suggest that there have not been any number of public hearings, and the public certainly has been invited, but there's a difference between making it available and creating a circumstance where they really get engaged.
I couldn't agree with you more, and I think one good reason the public is now more interested is because the price of gas really hits home. When it was inconvenient to sit in traffic, that was one thing. But when it's inconvenient to sit in traffic and to pay for it, when you start hitting the pocketbook, that's when people start to become aware that there's a problem. And so I think the public is going to require and demand more participation in this whole process that we're talking about. But the public has been sidetracked, with well, that's the way it is.
Sure.
But hey, when it's $40 to fill up a gas tank, or 50 even, and I think it's still going up, it takes on a different appearance.
Boy, it sure does, which brings us to a conversation about the environment and climate change, and certainly this week we celebrated Earth Day, I should say, on the 22nd, and in this community we're really starting to talk more about the impacts of climate change. There have been these very interesting modeling and simulation exercises, both from the folks at Lockheed Martin. They released some this week as well. There is this video that comes out of Old Dominion University and VMask that I think you're seeing it now, that looks at downtown Hampton, Ernie Gates, and you don't have enough reporters who can cover what's going to happen if there's this kind of water. There it is. That's what downtown Hampton looks like. As we talk about this issue of sea level rise, do you have the sense that this is getting more attention, and in terms of a public policy issue, is there clarity for you in terms of what to do about it?
I don't think anybody has clarity about what to do about it. I think finally people are recognizing that the rising sea level is a fact, and there's a big gap between acknowledging that in these simulations and other things.
We're seeing some of the Hampton Roads now.
And then seeing climate change in the political dimension, which gets very foggy. And that's why the political dimension is still up for grabs.
Yeah.
Plenty of people in denial. I think when you talk about sea level rise, it's measurable. There's a fact there. And whether you can project that Hampton will be underwater, out to the Coliseum, that's another question. But I think people are starting to recognize that drainage matters. If you want to get very kind of rudimentary city services about drainage matters, what you do to the bay matters, where you put your breakwaters matter, those kinds of things. Or maybe where you build that high rise, how close to the shoreline do you build? So those are being considered. I don't think people have solid answers, though.
It's also in how you escape. I mean, if a hurricane comes, it's the state is using new models for sea level change and storm surge. And the places that are going to be wet, if we get a big hurricane, it's a lot bigger part of our cities than it used to be.
I think you're working on an editorial about that.
I am, as a matter of fact.
And maybe when you get done here, at this very moment. Who knows? Yeah, it's going to be very interesting to see where this goes. In fact, next Friday night on What Matters, we have a conversation underway with scientists at the Virginia Institute of Marine Science. And as Ernie Gates rightly says, we can spend all day long talking about the politics of it. Next Friday night, we're just going to look at the facts. We're going to look at what's happening to sea levels off our shores, what the implications are from a public policy perspective, and what they are in terms of how we build as well. So that'll be an important conversation next Friday night. The other important development coming up here in a couple of weeks, just a couple of weeks, is the Republican convention, the United States Senate seat being vacated by the retiring Senator John Warner. That's coming up May 30th and 31st. And two key contenders, three in total. Ernie Gates, two key contenders at the moment, Jim Gilmore, Delegate Bob Marshall. What are you all editorializing at the Daily Press on that issue?
We won't get into an endorsement in a primary. It's a very rare thing that we would do that, and we aren't going to do it this time. We have suggested that it's a good idea for Bob Marshall and Jim Gilmore to present themselves.
Marshall on the right, Gilmore on the left, if you're looking at your screen.
To present themselves in a debate format, that people ought to see them on their toes, not just go through the convention process, who's the best organizer, who has the most money, and so on. But
Former
let's see
Governor
those
Gilmore has
candidates.
put the brakes on that and said that
Absolutely.
won't be happening.
He doesn't want to do that, and probably he's counted noses, and he can win without doing it. Our view is that people deserve to see that kind of combat of ideas in those two men.
Yeah. Don Lozado, how about from the pilot's perspective on this Senate race?
The same as Ernie. We're not going to get involved in an internecine fight. But it strikes me that this is an interesting moment for the Republican Party in Virginia, because they're running a candidate against an extraordinarily popular former governor, and out of the three candidates who were initially in this race, they've ended up with the right hand and the far right hand, and it'll be an interesting dynamic to see how this plays out, both at the convention and in the general come the fall.
Well, because observers would tell you that Jim Gilmore, I mean, I think most observers would agree that Delegate Marshall is to the right of Jim Gilmore.
Especially on social issues.
On social issues,
right.
Indeed so. And there are some issues that each of your papers deal with that are specific to your own papers, depending on the side of the water that you find yourself on. For you, Don Lozado, in the pilot, it's been dealing with the future of Waterside. And those of us who were here in 1982 when they opened that thing up, that looked like the turning point, the linchpin, the whole thing of the new downtown.
It was, as my boss said today, the first apple seed.
Yes,
and the tree has grown up quite well. And I think the city is rightfully taking a look at that, at the core of that tree, and seeing how healthy it is.
Because the city is having to pay quite a lot of money to keep it maintained.
It has to pay quite a lot of money. But and it is also sitting on an enormously valuable piece of property. Having said that, I have no idea what the city ought to do with Waterside. There are much smarter people than me, I'm sure, who are thinking about it.
But your paper thinks it's right to take a look at that.
Oh, absolutely. It's a good idea to take a look at that. Yeah.
And that, of course, was part of those developments that were very popular in the 80s, the Rouse developments, the Inner Harbor in Baltimore and all the rest, just never seemed to have the same kind of impact in Norfolk that it did in Baltimore for a lot of different reasons.
But it did over a long period of time. It's been reinvented a couple times already.
Yes.
Over a long period of time, it did sort of provide an anchor for the downtown revitalization. Now, whether it's it was underneath all that, or whether it was just simply the seed that led to all of it is hard to say now.
Yeah, and Brenda Andrews, you have been writing a good deal in the New Journal and Guide about dropout rates and these very alarming reports that are coming out that look at dropout rates, and certainly demographically as well.
We deal a lot with dropout rates. We deal a lot with the statistics in our country that disproportionately affect the African American community. And although dropouts apply across the board, many of the dropouts are African American young men. And we do deal with the crisis as we see it in the African American community as it regards dropout rates. In fact, this week's issue, we're talking about, I think, a new study. It's like about 1 million dropouts, and that is just unacceptable in our country in the 21st century. It's unacceptable. Another issue we deal with is prison population. 1 in 100 Americans, and then 1 in 9 of those are African Americans. We have the highest rate of incarceration in the world. Those are not acceptable in the 21st century, and those are the kinds of issues that we try to put out so that people can get some justifiable anger and decide that we will not accept it, period.
One of the other stories that has been very interesting to observe that speaks to some, in particular, when you talk about these dropout rates, there are all these demographic differences, as you point out. One of the other stories that has that comes into racial relationships is happening in the city of Hampton, and that has to do with the former city manager, George Wallace, a candidate for council at the moment, and a lawsuits that were filed in relationship to his termination from his post as city manager. Do I have that reasonably right, Ernie Gates?
Reasonably right. I wouldn't take the racial aspect of that too far. The lawsuit, I believe, was filed by Mr. Wallace because he felt he had to stand up for what he thought were his rights, and he felt he was being humiliated, although he knew he was going to be fired. It was apparent to anybody who saw the election preceding that George was on his way out. And the question was, how was it handled? George felt it was handled in a way that humiliated him, and his response, and there's a racial aspect here, in that he's decided, I have to stand up and show my kids, my own kids, and the community that I'm not going to be treated that way.
That was an extraordinary council meeting.
It was. I think the suit, without judging George's motivation, the way it was handled and the lawsuit itself was a net loss for all of Hampton. Today, when George Wallace is now running for city council in a contest that includes 3 of the people who fired him, it comes up again. But I think what comes up is not so racial in the end. Race is always a part of politics. But what comes up is much more who's in charge of the city of Hampton.
Right.
And George represents a certain style of management and an idea of progress, and the current majority represents a different one. And that's, I think people do understand that distinction, and that's going to determine the election.
It's going to be interesting, and you have editorialized in favor of exposing the amount of money that was spent in this process, the public funds that were expended in this process.
It's, you know, we have some terrible open government laws in this state, and sometimes the best way to handle the weakness of the law is to keep shining a light in what we do, and what we do online or on TV or in the press. And we did a lot of that. And I think it did help create an atmosphere in the public where they had to undo the secrecy around that settlement. So now people do know the settlement was for $450,000. The city government spent another $350,000 or so in its own expenses. The question remains, how much of that went to the lawyers? How much of that went to George Wallace? I'm frankly hoping, and we said in the paper this morning, that again, the public pressure, if the voters want to know that, and I would if I were a voter, they have an opportunity right now in a campaign to ask face to face, and you'll find out.
It's such a great process we have, isn't it? I mean, it really is. Next time we have you all come back, we want to talk a lot about, or some, about the business of journalism, because it seems to me the work that you're describing, that shining the light, is in great peril given some of the business realities of the world of journalism at the moment. But that will be a conversation we will have to save for next time around. Does that sound acceptable? What are you working on? You were working on your sea level rise one.
Well, we're in the middle of elections,
yeah,
as you know, local elections. So the pilot takes endorsements extraordinarily seriously, and so it's an agonizing process.
All right, so we'll check back in with all of you. Thank you so much, Don Lozado, for being with us today. Ernie Gates, nice to see you. Thank you I hope you'll come back and do this again. And Brenda Andrews, thanks for being with us as well, and we'll look forward to the digitizing of all that great material.
It's a big project.
Well, let us know when that happens, because we'd
will.
surely like to do some more on that. That's going to be very important development. Well, I'll be back in just a moment with a final thought. Just to be absolutely clear, tonight's final thought is about the Virginian-Pilot, but neither Don Lozado nor any other pilot staffer had anything to do with it, nor any knowledge of it. I promise, Don, it's true. When pilot staffers learned in January that their newspaper was up for sale, they got a taste of what keeps publishers awake at night. It's not that newspapers don't make money anymore, but they don't make as much as they did, and nobody's been able to bring back the good old days before ad revenue was picked off by Craigslist. But there are a few things that newspapers do that the online world hasn't co-opted. And it's all very close to home. Local investigative journalism, in-depth coverage of the goings-on of citizenship, stories about the people and the issues that merit our attention. That is, in fact, the way that Frank Batten Sr. grew a communication empire. Starting here with a good newspaper, championing desegregation when it was a lonely thing to do, acquiring more newspapers along the way, and making a mint off an idea most of us laughed at, that people would actually watch a channel full of weather forecasts. Who's laughing now about that one? Frank Batten is an entrepreneurial thinker who last year donated $100 million to the University of Virginia's new Frank Batten School of Leadership and Public Policy. In making the gift, Mr. Batten said, "There is an urgent need to develop a new generation of entrepreneurial leaders who can bring about transformational change." Amen, Mr. Batten. If there were ever an industry in need of entrepreneurship and transformational change, it is newspapering. We will watch your Weather Channel regardless of who owns it, but there are many who hope that you and your family will keep the Pilot close to home. Why not make the Pilot a laboratory for the newspaper of the future? Try out some big ideas. Reach out to the online world to see what's possible. You and your family have given so much to this community, and saving local journalism by transforming the industry matches the mission you set out for Landmark, to be distinguished by extraordinary public service and outstanding business performance. Nobody says it'll be easy, but you're the man who turned isobars into must-see TV. And it doesn't sound like anybody's standing in line to buy the Pilot, so could you just take one more look? That's it for this week's edition of What Matters. We are here reaching out to the online world as well. We have a brand new website that we are debuting tonight. It's whatmatters.tv. At that site, you can do just about anything. You can send us an idea about a show. You can log on to our web blog. We're kind of excited about that. We'll get your comments. You can post them up there. Let us know what you think about this show or any other show that we do. And you can also watch these shows if you happen to have missed it. Now, if you are not on the web, you can still write to us, and I am properly chastened for my use last week of the term snail mail, which Mr. Frank from Yorktown found derogatory. I meant it as a colloquialism, but upon reflection, the common vernacular can sometimes carry an aroma of disdain, and that certainly was not our intention. Thank you, Mr. Frank, for pointing that out. And you can send us mail through the Postal Service at What Matters, 5200 Hampton Boulevard, Norfolk, Virginia, 23508, or give us a call at 889-9437. Thanks for being with us tonight. Next week, a look at sea level rise. We saw how sea water poured into the earthen bowl that is New Orleans. We'll see what happens in Hampton Roads next Friday night.